Of course, you know that a prairie dog is no more of a dog than a groundhog is a pig.
Before 1800, an estimated 5 billion prairie dogs lived across the American West, from Canada to Mexico.
It's been estimated that 100 years ago, there were 5 billion prairie dogs in North America.
Covering the plains with underground apartment complexes that shifted over the centuries like sand dunes. Their colonies once exceeded 25,000 acres in northeast Montana alone, collectively covering hundreds of thousands of acres of thriving grassland ecosystem.
Why, there was one village alone in Texas that covered 25,000 square miles.
By the 1990s, prairie dogs occupied just 2% of their historic range. They had become one of the most maligned and persecuted animal species in the western United States. Montana ranchers dismissed them as destructive pests that competed with livestock for grass and caused economic losses when cattle stepped into their burrows. Agricultural associations supported government-sponsored poisoning programs that had been eliminating prairie dog colonies since the 1930s.
Fields like this one west of JBS Parkway, the prairie dogs were gassed out and killed.
A 2020 survey in northern Montana found that well over half the area's landowners believed prairie dogs should not live on public land at all.
Prairie dogs were burrowing under people's yards and disturbing and tearing up irrigation lines.
But behind the scenes, something extraordinary was taking shape, quietly, patiently, and relentlessly. And what happened next shocked ranchers, scientists, and even the most dedicated conservationists. To understand how the most persecuted rodent in the American West became the key to restoring an entire ecosystem, we need to go back to what was lost. Prairie dogs weren't just abundant. They were ecosystem engineers whose industrious prairie pruning and ingenious tunnel systems supported over 100 other species across the Great Plains. Welcome to Forgotten Lands, where we uncover the impossible transformations that changed everything. The Lakota, Dakota, and other indigenous peoples of the prairie had shaped and depended on the ecosystems prairie dogs created for thousands of years. Some relied on prairie dogs for nourishment during thin times, or used them as ceremonial food. The vast underground cities these rodents built provided homes for black-footed ferrets, swift foxes, burrowing owls, prairie rattlesnakes, and countless other species. But European settlers were remarkably effective at shooting and poisoning prairie dogs and plowing up their burrows. They saw the rodents as competitors for the grass their cattle needed, and they believed prairie dog burrows caused livestock injuries when animals stepped into them. The systematic destruction began almost immediately after settlement and accelerated through the early 1900s. The government-sponsored poisoning programs of the 1930s were particularly devastating. Entire colonies that had existed for centuries were eliminated in a matter of months. The poisoning was so thorough that many areas went from supporting thousands of prairie dogs to having none at all. The ecological consequences were catastrophic. Black-footed ferrets, which depend exclusively on prairie dogs as prey, were driven to the brink of extinction. Swift foxes disappeared from vast areas where they had once thrived. Burrowing owls lost the underground homes where they raised their chicks. Mountain plovers and ferruginous hawks lost critical habitat and food sources. By the time scientists began studying prairie ecosystems in detail, the damage seemed irreversible. The few remaining prairie dog colonies were small, isolated, and constantly under threat from continued persecution. Shooting prairie dogs remained largely unregulated and unrestricted in Montana, further hampering any possibility of recovery. The species had also become vulnerable to sylvatic plague, the same bacteria that causes the Black Death in humans. Prairie dogs are highly susceptible to plague, and outbreaks could wipe out entire colonies in weeks. The combination of ongoing persecution and disease made the future look hopeless for both prairie dogs and the species that depended on them. Agricultural communities continued to view prairie dogs as nothing more than destructive pests. Ranchers argued that the rodents destroyed grass and vegetation, reducing the carrying capacity of grazing land. Livestock associations claimed that prairie dog burrows caused significant economic losses when cattle and horses stepped into them and broke their legs. Even many conservationists had written off prairie dogs as a lost cause. The species was so maligned and the opposition so entrenched that most restoration efforts focused on other, more charismatic species. The idea of deliberately reintroducing prairie dogs to areas where they had been eliminated seemed not just impractical, but politically impossible. If you're fascinated by this story of ecological resurrection against impossible odds, comment Prairie below And let me know what you think about restoring species that everyone considers pests. But in 2015, American Prairie Reserve decided to prove the skeptics wrong. Working with Defenders of Wildlife and the Prairie Dog Coalition of the Humane Society, they launched an ambitious prairie dog restoration program on their private lands in central Montana. Their goal was nothing less than restoring the shortgrass prairie ecosystem to its full ecological potential. The early challenges were enormous. Prairie dogs had been absent from much of the area for decades, and the remaining populations were small and fragmented. The threat of sylvatic plague meant that any restoration effort could be wiped out by disease. Local opposition remained fierce, with many ranchers and landowners viewing the project as a direct threat to their way of life. American Prairie's approach was methodical and science-based. They began by seeding areas with plant mixtures preferred by prairie dogs, creating the ideal habitat conditions for colony establishment. They mowed the perimeters of existing colonies to encourage expansion and help control predators. Most importantly, they developed innovative techniques for relocating animals to create new colonies in suitable habitat. Disease mitigation became a critical component of the restoration effort. The team developed methods for applying insecticide dust to eliminate the fleas that spread plague bacteria. They monitored colonies continuously for signs of disease and intervened quickly when outbreaks occurred. These techniques, refined over years of trial and error, dramatically improved the survival rates of restored populations. The breakthrough came when researchers from the Smithsonian's National Zoo and Conservation Biology Institute began studying prairie dog behavior using revolutionary tracking technology. Working with scientists from Swansea University in Wales, they developed collars originally designed for tracking penguins underwater, an environment similarly resistant to conventional satellite tracking. For the first time in history, scientists could map the underground world of prairie dogs. The collars measured each animal's acceleration and angle, and by triangulating with sensors posted throughout the colonies, researchers could determine where and how far the prairie dogs traveled both above and below ground. What they discovered shocked everyone involved in the project. Prairie dogs weren't just digging simple burrows. They were creating vast underground cities with sleeping quarters, hibernation areas, maternity wards, and thermal refuges. These tunnel systems extended across areas larger than football fields and provided critical habitat for dozens of other species. The ecological benefits became apparent almost immediately. Prairie dog colonies created entirely novel habitat types through their intensive grazing. They increased the diversity of forbs and flowering plants, creating sparsely vegetated areas perfect for nesting birds while providing fresh, protein-rich growth for grazing ungulates. The underground cities provided thermal refuges that became increasingly important as climate extremes intensified. In a landscape with little shade or protection from brutal winter cold and summer heat, the consistent temperatures in prairie dog tunnel systems offered critical survival habitat for numerous species. If this incredible story of ecosystem engineering is inspiring you, hit that like button and subscribe to Forgotten Lands for more stories of species that transform entire landscapes. The results exceeded all scientific projections. Black-footed ferrets, one of North America's most endangered mammals, began establishing viable populations in the restored prairie dog colonies. These ferrets depend exclusively on prairie dogs as prey, and their recovery had been impossible without sufficient prairie dog populations to support them. Burrowing owls returned to areas where they hadn't been seen for decades. These puffball-bodied birds shimmy into prairie dog tunnels where they raise their chicks on the plentiful insects that thrive in the underground ecosystem. Multiple breeding pairs established territories in the restored colonies, indicating that the habitat quality was sufficient to support reproduction. Swift foxes began reappearing in areas where they had been absent for generations. These small predators use prairie dog burrows for denning and rely on the diverse prey base that prairie dog colonies support. Their return indicated that the ecosystem restoration was succeeding at multiple trophic levels. The diversity of species using prairie dog colonies was staggering. Prairie rattlesnakes, tiger salamanders, horned lizards, and badgers all utilized the tunnel systems. Ferruginous hawks and other raptors used the colonies as hunting grounds, taking advantage of the concentrated prey base. Mountain plovers found the sparsely vegetated areas around colonies perfect for nesting. Perhaps most importantly, the restoration work at American Prairie began changing attitudes toward prairie dogs throughout the region. The Fort Belknap Indian Reservation, working with tribal wildlife managers, had already demonstrated that prairie dogs, black-footed ferrets, swift foxes, and bison could coexist successfully. Their decades of restoration work had created one of the few places in the world where all four species lived together as they had historically. Montana Fish, Wildlife and Parks proposed the state's first prairie dog conservation lease, nearly 3,000 acres in the Rosebud area. This represented a fundamental policy shift from persecution to protection, acknowledging prairie dogs' role as a keystone species essential to grassland ecosystem health. The scientific community began recognizing prairie dogs not as pests, but as ecosystem engineers whose activities were essential for maintaining grassland biodiversity. Research showed that prairie dogs increased the ability of soil and vegetation in the arid Great Plains to conserve the region's scant precipitation. Their grazing patterns created habitat heterogeneity that supported far more species than uniform grassland. The economic arguments against prairie dogs also began to crumble. While ranchers had long claimed that prairie dogs destroyed grass and reduced carrying capacity, scientific studies showed that the rodents actually increased plant diversity and created more nutritious forage for livestock. The sparsely vegetated areas around colonies provided high-quality grazing that cattle preferred over uniform grassland. The underground cities prairie dogs created were revealed to be marvels of engineering that provided ecosystem services worth millions of dollars. The tunnel systems improved soil aeration, increased water infiltration, and created carbon storage opportunities. The thermal refuges they provided became increasingly valuable as climate change intensified temperature extremes across the Great Plains. Private landowners began finding ways to tolerate and even benefit from prairie dog colonies on their property. Some ranchers discovered that the diverse habitat created by prairie dogs attracted wildlife watchers and ecotourists, generating new revenue streams. Others found that the improved soil health and plant diversity in prairie dog areas actually enhanced their grazing operations. The restoration success at American Prairie inspired similar efforts across the Great Plains. Researchers identified priority areas for black-tailed prairie dog conservation, extending from Montana to Texas and New Mexico. The techniques developed in Montana were being adapted for use in other states where prairie dog populations had been decimated. Today, as hundreds of prairie dogs thrive in restored colonies across Montana's plains, it's hard to imagine that anyone ever thought these ecosystem engineers were nothing more than destructive pests. But sometimes the most important transformations happen not despite the opposition and persecution, but because someone was willing to prove that every species has a role to play in healthy ecosystems. The ranchers who had spent generations trying to eliminate prairie dogs were witnessing something they had never thought possible. The destructive pests had become the foundation of thriving ecosystems that supported over 100 other species. The economic burden had become a source of ecosystem services and even tourism revenue. The competitors for grass had become partners in creating more diverse and resilient grasslands. From 5 billion prairie dogs to 2% of their historic range to hundreds of thriving colonies being restored, the prairie dog recovery proves that no species is ever truly beyond saving, as long as someone is willing to understand their ecological role and fight for their restoration.